The clutch of quail eggs cost 75 cents from a collector's abandoned setup at the back of the Pratt County feed store on a Monday morning in June of 1934. And the reason it cost 75 cents was that the collector had gone bust, and the storekeeper wanted the whole mess off his back shelf before the eggs went bad and started to smell. Odessa Vane had come in for chick starter and a spool of fence wire, not for a crate of wild Bobwhite eggs packed in sawdust with a busted kerosene incubator sitting useless beside them. But she stood at the back counter longer than she meant to, looking at the eggs through the slats of the crate. There were 40 of them, small and cream white and nearly identical, laid by wild birds a man named Pruitt had trapped out of the draws south of town the previous spring, meaning to raise them for the restaurant trade in Wichita before his money ran out and his wife made him quit. The storekeeper, a heavy man named Otis Rayner, who had known Odessa's father, said the eggs were probably no good anymore. The incubator had failed twice already, and he'd take 50 cents just to be rid of the smell if the eggs went. Odessa picked one up. It was warm from the stovepipe it had been sitting near, not hot, which meant it hadn't cooked, and she turned it in her fingers and thought about the chapter on game bird propagation she had read in January in a government bulletin the county extension office kept in a drawer nobody opened. She paid 75 cents. Rayner threw in the busted incubator for nothing, glad to see it go. Before we find out what Odessa does with a crate of quail eggs and a broken incubator, tell us in the comments where you're watching from. This channel reaches people from all across the country, and we love knowing where our stories land. If you haven't subscribed yet, hit that button now. We have new stories every week, and had been running her mother's 80 acres alone since the spring of 1933, when her mother's heart had given out in the kitchen on a Sunday and left Odessa with a mortgage, 11 laying hens, a garden plot, and the specific quiet that comes to a house when the last person who remembers your childhood is gone. The 80 acres sat on the sandy draws south of the Pratt County line, ground too thin and too broken for wheat, ground her father had always said was better suited to something other than row crops, though he had died in 1929 before he ever said what. She had $14 in the household account the morning she bought the eggs, and the $14 was supposed to last until the garden came in, and she had spent 75 cents of it on something that most of the county would have called a fool's investment: wild birds that weren't chickens and weren't ducks and weren't anything a normal person raised for a normal reason. But Odessa had read the bulletin twice. The government men writing for the Department of Agriculture had been documenting a real gap in the market since the drought years began cutting into commercial poultry margins. Hotels in Wichita, Kansas City, and as far as Chicago were paying restaurant prices for game bird meat and eggs that ordinary chicken operations could never touch, because Bobwhite quail were still legally classified as wildlife in most states, which meant supply was thin and scattered and almost entirely dependent on wild trapping rather than controlled breeding. A man who could produce them consistently, with proper permits and clean documentation, was selling into a market that barely existed yet because almost nobody had figured out how to do it reliably. Pruitt hadn't managed it. His incubator had failed twice because he'd tried to run wild-trapped eggs through equipment built for chicken eggs, at chicken temperatures, with chicken humidity, and Bobwhite eggs did not forgive that kind of carelessness. They wanted narrower heat, higher humidity in the final days, and turning by hand at least 3 times daily, or the embryos stuck to the shell and died before they ever pipped. She fixed the incubator herself over 2 days, replacing the failed thermostat coil with one she salvaged from a broken brooder lamp and packing the interior with damp burlap to hold humidity steady through the Kansas summer heat. The bulletin had specified numbers most poultry keepers never bothered learning because chickens forgave a wider margin of error than Bobwhites did. 99.5 degrees for the first 18 days, humidity held near 60%, then a final push in the last 3 days to something closer to 75% to keep the membrane soft enough that the chicks could pip through without drying fast against the shell and dying half-hatched, which was, she suspected, exactly what had killed most of Pruitt's first 2 attempts. She set the temperature and checked it against her mother's kitchen thermometer 3 times a day, morning, noon, and before bed, adjusting the damper on the lamp box by fractions when the Kansas heat outside pushed the interior warmer than it should run. She turned every egg by hand at sunrise, noon, and dusk for 21 days, marking each shell with a soft pencil X on one side so she'd know which had been turned and which hadn't, because a misturn meant an embryo stuck to the membrane on one side and dead before it ever had a chance to develop properly. It was tedious work, the kind that asked for patience rather than skill, and she had plenty of the former and was building the latter one clutch at a time. She lost 4 eggs in the first week to a fluctuation she couldn't entirely explain, the temperature spiking during an afternoon when the July sun came in low through the barn window and warmed the lamp box past what the thermometer had shown that morning. And after that, she moved the whole operation to the root cellar, where the temperature held steadier through the worst of the afternoon heat, and she could still check it without disturbing the eggs more than necessary. On the 18th day, she began candling them each evening by lamplight, holding each egg up against the flame to watch for the faint dark shadow and movement that meant a living chick inside, setting aside the 2 that showed nothing and smelled faintly wrong when she lifted them close, because a rotten egg left in with live ones risked poisoning the whole clutch if it broke. 26 of the 40 eggs hatched over the span of 2 days rather than 1, which the bulletin said was normal for a wild trapped clutch laid across a season rather than a single controlled cycle. She had expected fewer. The chicks that came out were smaller than any poultry chick she had ever raised, barely the size of a walnut, mottled brown and buff with dark stripes down their backs, and they came out running rather than stumbling, alert in a way baby chickens never were, already looking for cover before their down had properly dried. She had to move fast to get them from the cellar to the brooder box before they scattered into the corners of the room, and by the second hatching day, she'd learned to keep a shallow-sided crate close at hand and simply lift each chick straight from the incubator tray into it the moment it dried enough to stand. Silas Kemp was at the south fence the following Tuesday, checking a stretch of drainage ditch that ran along the shared property line between his family's section and Odessa's, which was the kind of pretext a man used when he had noticed a truck coming back from the feed store with something unusual in the bed and wanted an excuse to find out what it was without asking directly. He was tall through the shoulders with sun-weathered forearms and the specific patience of a man who farmed wheat on ground that had failed him 3 years running and had learned not to expect much from any given season. He had been at that fence with some version of a ditch or a fence post excuse since the previous autumn, not long after Odessa's mother died, though neither of them had said so out loud. "Heard you bought quail eggs off Otis," he said, leaning on the top rail. "Bobwhite," she said, "wild trapped out of Pruitt's operation before it went under." He looked toward the barn where she'd set up the brooder box, a low crate lined with burlap and warmed by the same hover lamp she'd used for chicks, except she'd covered the top with wire mesh because the government bulletin had been specific about one thing above all others. Bobwhite quail did not run from danger the way chickens did. They launched straight up, and a startled chick in an open brooder could break its neck against a low ceiling before a person even understood what had happened. Pruitt lost his shirt on that operation, Silas said. Pruitt ran chicken equipment and chicken timing on wild eggs, she said. That's not the same as the eggs being worthless. He was quiet a moment, the particular quiet of a man revising something. "What are you going to do with 26 quail?" "Grow them out, sell what I can as flight-ready birds to game preserves, and sell the eggs and dressed birds to hotel kitchens once I've got a laying flock established." She had the numbers already, worked out in the notebook she'd started keeping the night she bought them. "The market's thin because almost nobody's doing it right. I intend to be one of the people who does." He didn't tell her it was a bad idea. He didn't tell her it was a good one either. He looked at the brooder box through the open barn door for a long moment, and then he said the drainage ditch would need clearing before the next rain, and that he'd be back Thursday to do it. And he went back to his own land, and Odessa understood, without either of them saying so, that the ditch was going to need clearing every week for a while. He came Thursday, and the ditch, which had needed perhaps 20 minutes of actual attention, took him closer to 2 hours, most of which he spent at the fence asking careful, specific questions about brooder temperatures and feed ratios that told her he'd gone home the previous Tuesday and thought about it more than a man clearing a ditch had any obligation to. She answered plainly, the way she answered most things, and by the third week of July, he had stopped bringing tools altogether and simply came to the fence and asked what had changed since the last visit. And she told him, and it became, without either of them naming it as such, the shape of their Tuesdays and Thursdays. The county's opinion formed the way it always did, fast and mostly wrong. Verna Oakes at the dry goods store told two customers that Odessa Vane had gone soft in the head buying wild birds off a bust collector, the kind of thing a woman alone on a failing farm did when she'd stopped thinking clearly. Otis Rayner, to his credit, told anyone who asked that the girl had fixed his incubator better than the man he'd bought it from originally, and that he wasn't in a position to call her foolish when she'd gotten it working in 2 days flat. The county extension agent, a careful man named Foster Lindquist, who had written the very bulletin she'd been reading, drove out in July after hearing about it from Rayner and stood at the brooder pens for the better part of an hour asking specific questions about her feed ratio and her turning schedule, and left with the particular expression of a man who has come expecting to find an amateur and found something else instead. The chicks grew fast, faster than chickens by any comparable measure, reaching a size at 6 weeks that took a laying hen 10 to reach, though they stayed small by any absolute standard, compact and dense-breasted, dressing out at barely 8 or 9 ounces even at full maturity. She fed them a mixture heavier in protein than any poultry ration she'd used before, close to 30% by her own careful calculation, mixing in ground insects she collected from the garden and cracked millet along with the commercial starter, because the government bulletin had been clear that Bobwhite chicks raised on standard chicken feed grew slow and weak and prone to picking at each other out of nutritional frustration. She kept them in a covered run once they were out of the brooder, low-roofed but padded along the top with burlap sacking, because a bird that launched straight up when startled needed something to hit besides bare wood, and she had already lost one chick in the first week to a broken neck against an unpadded corner before she understood how serious the bulletin's warning had been. She learned to move slowly around the runs, to keep her shadow from falling suddenly across the birds, to speak low and steady before she opened any gate, because a spooked flock of bobwhites did not simply scatter the way chickens did. They went straight up in a single startled convulsion of wing beats, and a run full of birds launching at once against a low roof could cost her half a dozen chicks in the time it took to blink. She built the roofs a foot higher than the bulletin recommended after that first loss, and she never again lost a bird to the ceiling. By August, she had confirmation of what she'd suspected since the eggs first arrived warm from Rayner's stovepipe. The birds were healthy, alert, breeding true to type, and entirely unlike anything else being raised in Pratt County. She wrote to 3 hotel kitchens whose addresses she'd found listed in the back pages of a game bird trade circular Foster Lindquist had left with her, describing her operation plainly, the permits she'd already filed for with the State Game Commission, the size of her flock, her projected output. 2 wrote back within the month. One was from the Baltimore Hotel in Wichita, a kitchen that had been buying wild-trapped quail from a broker at prices that fluctuated wildly depending on what the trapping had yielded that season, and the head buyer wanted to know if she could guarantee a consistent supply through the winter. We're halfway through this story, and we want to know, have you ever raised an animal that everyone told you wasn't worth the trouble? Tell us in the comments. We read every one. And if you haven't subscribed yet, this is your reminder. New stories every week. She could. That was the entire point of what she'd built. A wild-trapped bird was a gamble every single time, dependent on how good the season's trapping had been and how many birds survived the transport and how many a broker was willing to move at what price on a given week. A properly bred and reared flock, managed on a documented schedule with permits in order, was not a gamble at all. It was arithmetic. She wrote back to the Baltimore Hotel's buyer with her projected output through the winter months, the number of birds she expected to reach flight-ready weight by each date, the number of eggs her established hens would produce weekly once the fall laying cycle began, and she signed the letter with the permit number Lindquist had helped her file, because a buyer in a city kitchen wanted to see that number before he wanted to see anything else a farm woman in Pratt County had to say about her birds. The second kitchen, when it wrote in October, asked nearly identical questions, and she answered them the same way, plainly and with numbers rather than promises, because she had learned by then that the promises were what had sunk Pruitt in the end. He had promised buyers birds he didn't have yet, on a schedule his broken incubator couldn't support, and when the promises came due empty, the buyers had gone elsewhere and stayed there. Odessa did not promise anything she hadn't already counted. The first order came in September, 40 dressed birds and 6 dozen eggs, and the check that arrived from the Baltimore hotel's kitchen was more money than Odessa had seen from any single transaction on the farm since her mother died. She sat at the kitchen table with it for a long moment before she did anything else, turning it over once as if the number might change the second time she looked at it. It did not change. It was, by her own calculation against the $11 her chickens had cleared her the previous autumn, nearly 9 times what the same effort in ordinary poultry would have returned. Silas was at the door that evening, later than his usual Thursday visits, with a bundle of burlap sacking he'd salvaged from his own barn because he'd noticed her covered runs were wearing thin at the corners. He set it down without ceremony and looked at the check still sitting on the table where she'd left it. "Baltimore Hotel," he said. 40 birds, 6 dozen eggs. They want a standing order through the winter if I can hold the numbers. Can you? I've got 60 birds coming to laying age in October, and Lindquist thinks the state will approve my breeder permit before Christmas, which means I can sell hatching stock to other operations too, not just dressed birds. She looked at the check again. This isn't luck. Pruitt had luck, and it broke on him because he didn't understand what he was working with. I understand what I'm working with. He was quiet in the way he was quiet when he was arriving at something. The eggs cost you 75 cents, he said. They did. And the ditch, he said, hasn't actually needed clearing since April. She looked at him across the kitchen table, at the dark eyes that had been finding reasons to stand at her south fence for the better part of a year, and she didn't say anything, because there wasn't anything that needed saying that the silence wasn't already saying better. "I know," she said finally. "I know you know," he said. By the following spring, the flock numbered close to 200 birds across 3 covered runs, with a 4th under construction using lumber Silas had helped haul from a torn-down grain elevator outside town. The 2 of them working most Saturdays through the winter with a thermos of coffee between them and very little need to talk about why he kept showing up. The Baltimore Hotel's standing order had grown to twice its original size, and a second Wichita kitchen had placed its first order in February, and Foster Lindquist had personally carried her breeder permit application through the state office faster than the usual paperwork moved, on the strength of what he'd seen on his July visit, and had apparently not stopped talking about since. Odessa had stopped thinking of the operation as something she'd started with 75 cents in a busted incubator and started thinking of it as what it had become, which was the actual income of the farm, the thing that had paid down half the mortgage her mother left behind and was going to pay the rest of it by autumn if the spring hatch came in the way the notebook projected it would. She had not sold a single breeding bird from her core flock, no matter what price had been offered for one, because the flock itself was the asset, the way a dairy herd was the asset and not any single cow. And she'd said as much to 2 different buyers who'd come out hoping to purchase her best breeding pairs outright and gone home with hatching eggs instead, which was, she'd explained to both of them, the only version of the sale she was ever going to make. Hatching eggs renewed themselves every season. A breeding pair sold outright was gone for good, and gone for good was not a trade she intended to make twice. She had learned, over that winter, to read the operation the way she imagined a banker read a ledger, not for what it had already returned, but for what it was positioned to return given another season of care. 200 birds meant close to 140 laying hens by spring, and if even half held to the production rate her original 26 had shown, the eggs alone would clear more in a season than her mother's chicken operation had cleared across 5 years combined. Silas came to supper on a Saturday in April, the same as he had most Saturdays since October, except this time he came to the front door instead of the back, which she noticed the way she noticed most things about him now, carefully and without saying so right away. "Front door," she said, opening it. Seemed like the occasion called for it. What occasion? He looked past her toward the covered runs visible from the porch, the low burlap top structures full of small, alert, striped birds that had come from a crate nobody else in the county had wanted. And then he looked back at her. "The county stopped saying you went soft in the head," he said. "Verna Oakes asked me last week if I thought you'd sell her a breeding pair. I don't sell breeding pairs to people who called me soft in the head. I told her that. They ate supper at the kitchen table where the first check had sat, and afterward they walked out to look at the runs in the last of the evening light, the birds settling for the night with the particular low murmuring sound Bobwhites made at dusk. Nothing like the noise of chickens, quieter and more private, the sound of something that had never fully stopped being wild and had simply decided on its own terms that this was a good enough place to stay. "I've got 60 acres my father left me," Silas said, "that never grew wheat worth harvesting, sandy ground, not unlike yours. I know your ground. I've been thinking it might grow something else." She looked at him in the porch light, at the man who had spent a year clearing a ditch that hadn't needed clearing and hauling lumber on Saturdays and showing up at a front door instead of a back one on an April evening that both of them understood was not really about supper. "Come Thursday," she said, "bring the soil survey for the north section. If we're going to talk about what that ground could carry, I want the numbers first." The corner of his mouth moved. The particular small motion she had learned meant more from him than most men's whole sentences. "Thursday," he said. He drove home, and she stood on the porch after he'd gone, listening to the quiet settling sounds coming from the covered runs. 26 birds grown to nearly 200, a crate of abandoned eggs that had cost 75 cents, grown into the actual income of a farm that had nearly gone under the year her mother died. Her father had never said what the sandy ground south of the house was better suited to. She had found out for herself, the hard way, which was the only way that ever really counted. If you've made it to the end of this story, thank you. Leave a comment below. What's the most unlikely thing you've ever seen someone build from almost nothing? Your stories are what makes this community what it is. Subscribe if you haven't already. We'll have a new story for you next week.